This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Natalie Edwards. Tonight's top stories. A life in prison handed to the killer of ex-Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2022, an incident that led to lasting social and political changes for a nation that's heading into a snap election. South Korea seeking a pragmatic approach to the North's growing nuclear threat as President Lee pushes to revive stalled talks with Pyongyang and Washington. Donald Trump heads to the World Economic Forum in Davos with his ambitions for Greenland set to overshadow economic discussions at the annual gathering. And Japan's TEPCO restarting the world's biggest nuclear plant in Niigata this hour, in the nation's first such move since the Fukushima disaster in 2011. Also in the bulletin, heavy snow pummels large parts of East Asia as an extreme Arctic cold front disrupts travel and forces authorities to step up emergency response measures. A court in Japan has sentenced the gunman charged with killing former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe 3.5 years ago to life in prison. He had previously admitted guilt. Now, a key question in the high-profile trial was how much weight should be given to the suffering of the 45-year-old killer as a child of a follower of a church, said to be central to his motivation for the crime. CNA's senior correspondent Michio Ishida with this report.
Tetsuya Yamagami is the son of a devoted follower of the Unification Church. It's a South Korean sect whose members were called Moonies after its founder Sun Myung-moon. A trial that went on for months showed how Yamagami's mother's donations to the church ruined the family financially and made him believe influential politicians were driving the success of the church. He wanted to take revenge by attacking the church leaders, but had difficulty getting close to them. He switched targets to former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe after learning he delivered a message to the congregation. Yamagami shot Mr. Abe during an election campaign speech in Nara in July 2022. Mr. Abe died almost instantly, and Yamagami was captured on the spot. He was accused of violating the Firearms and Sports Control Act, which is a major offense in Japan. Nara District Court called the act a terrible criminal offense and noted the suffering of Mr. Abe's wife, Ake Abe. With a mix of politics and religion in the case, court hearings took place 15 times in total. That's 3 times more than the average. Yamagami's lawyers asked for a sentence of no more than 20 years, taking into account the suffering he and his siblings went through as the children of the church follower, but the court dismissed it. The sentence will be finalized at the Supreme Court. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
And for a deeper look into the implications and fallout of this case, we're going to be speaking with Peter Chai, a researcher in political science at Waseda University. Seoul is pushing for diplomacy with Pyongyang and Washington to rein in the North's nuclear ambitions. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung highlights deepening mistrust, even as he warns of North Korea's growing atomic arsenal that could expand to become a global threat. CNA's senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk with the details.
Speaking at a news conference to mark the start of 2026, South Korean President Lee Jae Myung said ties between Seoul and Pyongyang have deteriorated to a point where even gestures of dialogue are viewed with suspicion by North Korea. Mr. Abe pointed to the recent drone infiltration issue, where the North slammed what is said were drone incursions from the South, despite denials from Seoul's defense ministry. Mr. Lee said it exacerbated tensions at a time when trust has already been severely damaged.
북측에서는 이 정권이 교체됐는데도 이 무인기가 또 날아왔더라. 이거 뭐냐? 말로는 뭐 대화, 소통, 협력, 평화, 안정 얘기하면서 뭐 이 사실은 공식적으로 못하니까 이제는 민간시켜서 몰래 또는 아니면 뭐 직접이든지 뭐 이렇게 하는 거 아니냐. 뭐 그런 의심도 들었을 테고.
Turning to North Korea's nuclear program, President Lee said Pyongyang continues to expand its capabilities despite years of international sanctions. He said North Korea is producing nuclear material sufficient to make an estimated 10 to 20 nuclear weapons per year, while continuing to improve intercontinental ballistic missile technology.
언젠가는 북한 체제 유지에 필요한 핵무기 체계, 그리고 미국을 포함한 전 세계를 위협할 만한 미사일, ICBM 기술 이런 걸 다 확보를 하고 그 다음에 남으면은 해외로 나가겠죠. 국가 밖으로, 국경 밖으로. 전 세계 위험이 도래하겠죠.
President Lee said a pragmatic and phased approach is needed to tackle this. He said it is important to first get North Korea to halt further production of nuclear material and missile development, then pursue arms reduction, and ultimately work towards denuclearization. Turning to the role of the United States, Mr. Lee said Washington remains central to peace and dialogue. He said U.S. President Donald Trump's willingness to engage directly with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un could help reopen channels for dialogue, adding that South Korea would work as a pacemaker to bring the two leaders once again to the negotiating table. Meanwhile, for South and North Korea, rebuilding trust will take time, and preventing further escalation remains the immediate priority, even as tensions and uncertainty persist. Im Nyan-seok, CNA, Seoul.
Well, at the same time, South Korea has launched a probe into the flying of drones into North Korean airspace. Authorities are raiding homes and offices of 3 civilians over their suspected involvement. And this comes just a day after South Korean President Lee Jae Myung ordered for a full investigation. North Korea earlier this month released pictures of debris of a drone shot down along its border city of Kaesong and demanded a detailed explanation from Seoul. The drone was found to have captured pictures of buildings in the vicinity. A South Korean man claimed responsibility for the drone flight, saying that he intended to detect radiation levels at a North Korean uranium processing plant some 40-plus kilometers north of Kaesong. Officials have vowed to conduct a thorough investigation. Mr. Lee said that loopholes were found in the government system to detect drones flown by civilians into North Korea and has called for the severe punishment of those responsible. A South Korean court has sentenced former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo to 23 years in prison. He was found guilty for charges including engaging in key action of insurrection concerning ex-President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration back in December 2024. Well, the court says Han was considered instrumental in setting up a cabinet meeting that worked to facilitate the martial law declaration. The 76-year-old has been detained immediately after the ruling. He's the first member from Yoon's cabinet to be sentenced over the short-lived decree. Well, this case is the first ruling that confirms the declaration of martial law in December 2024 constituted an insurrection. Taiwan's President William Lai has followed through on his undertaking not to appear at review hearings seeking his impeachment that got underway at the Legislative Yuan. The 2-day session, which follows last week's public hearings, is proceeding without Mr. Lai's participation. Opposition parties, the Kuomintang and the Taiwan People's Party, have accused Mr. Lai of trying to avoid scrutiny with his absence. Now, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party has dismissed the review as political theater, with its lawmakers largely boycotting the session. The impeachment against Mr. Lai was initiated by the opposition, and that's after his government refused to enact a legal amendment on tax spending. Now, we've got CNA senior correspondent Victoria Jen joining us live from Taipei. Vic, so why is Mr. Lai not attending this latest impeachment hearing session, and is that going to affect the proceedings?
Well, President William Lai says his decision is based on the Constitution. His position is that Taiwan's Constitution does not require the president to appear before or speak to the legislature, so he's not obligated to attend the impeachment review sessions. He also argued that while a president may choose to address lawmakers, the Constitution does not allow the legislators to question or scrutinize the head of state. But the opposition has reacted strongly. The KMT has condemned Lai's refusal, calling it disrespectful to the legislature to the legislative yuan in an attempt to avoid accountability. The KMT argued that the impeachment is the most serious constitutional power lawmakers have, and that Lai should have appeared to explain himself. As for whether his absence affects the proceedings, it does change how the hearings work. Now, under legislative yuan rules, if the person facing impeachment does not attend, questioning is suspended, and instead, the session is limited to statements by lawmakers from each party. So the hearings will still go ahead, but without direct answers from the president. This makes the process more political and less about direct examination.
And it's going to be months before the final impeachment vote. Vic, what does this mean for the parliamentary deadlock?
Well, in the short term, it means the political stalemate will continue and possibly deepen. The opposition led by the KMT is using impeachment to keep pressure on President Lai and the ruling DPP. Now, the DPP, meanwhile, says the opposition is abusing constitutional procedures to paralyze governance. Because the final impeachment vote is still months away, this issue won't be resolved anytime soon. Instead, it hangs over Parliament, adding to existing gridlock over defense spending, the national budget, and other key legislations. With neither side willing to back down, impeachment becomes less about actual removing a president and more about leverage and public opinion. So rather than breaking the deadlock, the impeachment process may end up reinforcing it, keeping Taiwan's parliament locked in confrontation for months to come.
Thanks for that report, CNA senior correspondent Victoria Jen in Taipei. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up after, or rather on East Asia tonight, Japan's markets on edge as the Prime Minister prepares to dissolve Parliament and investors question the country's fiscal footing. Plus, Beijing warns it will defend the Chinese firms as the EU moves closer to banning high-risk telecom suppliers. Hello again. You're watching East Asia Tonight, and Roland Lim joins us now with the business news. Roland, Japanese equities and bond yields apparently driving sentiment in the region today. Tell us more about that.
Right, you are. Yes, Japanese government bonds recovered somewhat after Finance Minister Katayama called for calm. But Japanese shares, well, that fell for a fifth straight session. The Japanese bond market still reeling from yesterday's sell-down, snapped back, albeit marginally. Yields on government bonds retreating following Finance Minister's remarks, asking market participants to calm down. Satsuki Katayama making the comments after the rout Tuesday, which pushed JGB yields to all-time highs. And that included those for super long debts like the 40-year tenor, which surpassed the 4% mark. That's the first of any maturity in the nation's sovereign debt in more than 30 years. Right now, 10-year bond yields is at 2.287%. It is 5.4 basis points lower. 40-year, 4.065, and that's down 11.9 basis points. The surge in yields largely triggered after Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi called for snap elections on Monday. She is pledging more spending and tax cuts to drive a return to inflation and growth after decades of stagnation. Now, it's been making investors worried that more stimulus means more strain on Japan's public finances. Checking in on the markets, US dollar against the Japanese yen is largely unchanged, although slightly stronger, 158 to the dollar. Meantime, the benchmark Nikkei 225 ending the day lower by 0.4%. Japan's markets in a fragile state this week, with the Prime Minister Takaichi set to dissolve Parliament on Friday, while the central bank meets on policy the very same day. And that Bank of Japan meeting on Friday will be closely watched. One analyst we spoke to noting that the slow pace of monetary tightening by the central bank is a significant contributor to the sell-off in the bond market.
I think the backdrop to this is also a very slow pace of normalization of BOJ policy. It's constantly perceived by many market participants as being behind the curve. The BOJ's own point, they've been arguing that underlying inflation or services inflation and so on have not yet risen much above 2%. So that's a disconnect in the market, which has caused real yields to be very low. And by real yields, I mean real front-end interest rates and the policy rate itself adjusted for realized inflation. Those are deeply negative, with inflation running at, in a 2%, high 2% handle. So as a result, the currency's been very weak. And when the currency is very weak, your cost of oil imports, your cost of food imports, most of which is invoiced in US dollars, tends to be much higher. That's keeping inflation more elevated without necessarily, solving the perception that the BOJ is constantly falling behind the curve. So I think a lot of people in the market are also waiting for a tougher stance, a less negative real policy rate, as well as lower inflation. So I think those could become anchors in stabilizing sentiment a little bit, but it could take some time. So in the interim, at least, we could see some volatility, but it will be very interesting to see what the BOJ says and does at its upcoming meeting this Friday. Our expectation is that they stay on hold, but the language around their decision will be very interesting to assess, to see at the margin whether or not they're turning a bit more hawkish.
Staying in Japan, Sony will be handing control of its flagship Bravia television brand to Chinese rival TCL Electronics. It is selling a 51% stake in its home entertainment business to form a joint venture with TCL that'll begin operations in April of next year. The TVs will carry Sony and Bravia names but use TCL's display technology. The Japanese firm's decision is widely seen as a move to cut exposure in a low-margin segment and to concentrate on more profitable areas. Now, Sony has been focused on expanding its intellectual property assets in anime, films, and sports broadcasts. Its move to spin off its home entertainment arm also taking place as many such firms in Japan have been losing ground in TVs to rivals like South Korea and China. TCL is among China's oldest and largest electronics conglomerates. It has grown to be a major budget TV name in the US and recently took over prominent display booths at the Consumer Electronics Show 2026 in Las Vegas. TCL shares ending the day high by nearly 15%, $12.50 Hong Kong, while Sony shares ending the day lower by nearly 1%, 3,701 yen apiece. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung also talking about chips and the economy in his New Year's speech. Now, Mr. Lee downplaying fresh U.S. tariff threats on foreign-made chips.
또 대만보다는 불리하지 않게 하겠다고 하는 합의를 그때 이런 경우를 대비해서 미리 다 합의를 해놨죠. 이럴 가능성이 있다고 그때 본 겁니다.
Last week, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick threatened 100% tariffs on memory chip makers that do not produce in the U.S. The South Korean chip makers Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix dominate the global memory chip market. Mr. Lee also spoke about the won's depreciation, which has lost around 8% of its value against the greenback since July. He says domestic policies to support the won isn't enough and compared the won's drop to the yen, which is facing greater pressure.
대한민국만의 독특한 현상은 아니어서 우리 대한민국만의 정책으로 쉽게 이걸 원상으로 되돌리기는 어려운 상황으로 판단이 됩니다. 지속적으로 가능한 수단들을 발굴해내고 또 환율이 안정될 수 있도록 노력해 나가겠습니다.
The won, meantime, has made some gains again following Mr. Lee's comments, appreciating 0.79% against the dollar, 1,469.04 to the dollar. A China Wonka managing to stave off an imminent default. The real estate developer says it has gained support for its bond repayment plan. It said it had received creditor approval to defer repayments owed on a $160 million bond with a put option. Under the deal, 90% of the creditors agreed to defer payment of the remaining 60% of principal by a year. Wang Ke also negotiating on payments on 2 other yuan bonds that matured last month. Analysts say the developer, which has some $50 billion in debt, will likely follow other cash-strapped Chinese developers by seeking multiple short-term extensions for repayments before looking at debt restructuring. Meanwhile, the European Union is moving to tighten its cybersecurity rules with plans to phase out equipment from so-called high-risk technology suppliers. The move is seen as targeting Chinese companies, including Huawei and ZTE, and could have wide-ranging implications for Europe's telecoms and digital infrastructure. Under draft revisions of the EU Cybersecurity Act, the bloc will evaluate which states or suppliers to ban. Once identified, the telecom providers will have 3 years to phase them out of their networks. The step builds on actions taken back in 2023 when the EU executive urged states to exclude Huawei and ZTE from their mobile networks due to security risks. The European Commission says the move is necessary amid a rise in cyber and ransomware attacks and growing concerns over foreign interference and reliance on non-EU technology providers. Scrutiny of Chinese technology has been tightening across Europe. The proposal still requires approval from EU governments and the European Parliament before becoming law. The EU did not name Huawei, but the company criticized the plans. China's foreign ministry also echoing Huawei's concern, saying that the move amounts to protectionism by the bloc and would incur huge economic costs. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer says that Washington is considering another round of trade talks with China ahead of a planned meeting between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping in April. Mr. Greer hinted the next round could move beyond the most sensitive flashpoints, including tech competition and China's supply of rare earth magnets. Remember, materials critical to global industrial supply chains. The comments following a meeting in Davos between U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. Mr. Bessent says China has followed through on an agreement to buy U.S. soybeans, with up to 25 million tons expected to be purchased in the coming year. Mr. He defended his country's economic track record and offered greater access to its domestic market to reduce trade imbalances. Meanwhile, uncertainty still hangs over U.S. trade policy. The Supreme Court declined to rule this week on President Trump's tariffs, pushing any decision out by at least another month. A ruling against the administration could open the door to more than $130 billion in tariff refunds and potentially weaken Trump's threats to impose further duties.
If we lose that case, it's possible we're going to have to do the best we can in paying it back. I don't know how that's going to be done very easily without hurting a lot of people. But we're waiting for that case anxiously.
Let's check in on the greater China markets, which ended in positive territory today. Shanghai Composite ending just above water, 4,116 points. Second Bourse Shenzhen component up by 0.7, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index advancing by nearly 0.4%. Gains also led by AI firms as sentiment steadied after regulators cooled exuberance this month. The head of U.S. software group Microsoft has warned that the artificial intelligence boom risks becoming a speculative bubble if it does not deliver tangible results in areas that will maintain public support.
We as even a global community have to get to a point where we're using this to do something useful that changes the outcomes of people and communities and countries and industries, right? Otherwise, I don't think this makes much sense, right? In fact, I would say we will quickly lose even the social permission to actually take something like energy, which is a scarce resource, and use it to generate these tokens. If these tokens are not improving health outcomes, education outcomes, public sector efficiency, private sector competitiveness across all sectors, small and large, right? And that, to me, is ultimately the goal.
Mr. Nadella's comments comes as data shows an increasing divide in AI adoption being concentrated among richer countries. And that'll do it for Business. We'll tell you.
Thanks so much for that, Roland. All right, time now for another break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, the killer of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe sentenced to life in prison 3 years after he shot him in broad daylight. Will the outcome bring closure? How will it affect Abe's protege in upcoming snap polls? Well, insights from an expert in just a bit. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines you're following. Donald Trump heads to the World Economic Forum in Davos. His ambitions to control Greenland set to overshadow economic discussions at the annual gathering. South Korea seeking a pragmatic approach to the North's growing nuclear threat, with President Lee pushing to revive stalled talks with Pyongyang and Washington. And Japan sentences the man who killed former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to life in prison more than 3 years after the broad daylight assassination. And for more, let's bring in Peter Chai, PhD researcher in political science at Waseda University. Well, thanks, Peter, for joining us this evening. So tell us more about this sentence. I mean, does this actually bring closure for people in Japan, or do you think it actually brings about, bigger questions about Japanese politics?
Thank you so much for having me. So I think the big implication of the trial is that we know that some members inside the Unification Church are under pressure to donate an exceedingly amount of money to the church. And also it exposed a kind of problem called religious second generations. And Yamagami is also one of them. And those children, their parents choose to be in this religion, but they didn't choose that. And then they are having a life-changing moments because of their parents' behavior. And sometimes they face social isolation. So this is one of the implications of the trial. And when such problems is linked to donations, political donations to political parties and to corruption problems of the political parties, it becomes controversial. And I think that is the implication of the trial. And this time we see that the life sentence issued by the court, which means that they met the demand of the prosecutors. And if you look at the trial, basically the defense team of Yamagami, they were seeking for a more lenient sentence. They were seeking for something under 20 years in prison. And they were trying to paint a picture of a very miserable life of this child growing up with his family members dying and suffering from financial problems. However, I think the key contest point of this trial is that Abe was not directly related to his family and to his misery. And if we ask the hypothetical question, if the person that Yamagami shot in public was someone very closely related to the church and to his mother directly, then we might expect
Peter, I have to interrupt you there
results.
Because I want to talk about what's going on beyond the courtroom, because this case has exposed how power can perhaps sometimes work behind the scenes. And since 2022, after the assassination, what has really changed in how politicians, they deal with religious groups, political donation, and behind the scenes support?
2023 and 2024, there were LDP slash fund scandals. And also recently, we also hear news the Takaichi political chapter, local chapter in Nara receiving an exceedingly amount of corporate donation from company, and also a high amount of donation from a mysterious kind of religious group. But when we talk about Takaichi, we find that her approval rates are around 70%, which is very high. And some experts observe this phenomenon, arguing that the voters or the public, especially young voters, they seem not to associate Takaichi with the LDP party. The reason for that is that we see a gap between the LDP support rate and the Takaichi support rate. And considering the scandals that Takaichi suffered last November about receiving exceedingly amount of corporate donation, as well as receiving large amount of religious donation, but still her support rates are very high. So this is kind of a phenomenon that people in Japan are observing. And it's very interesting that even though the public has been quite concerned about this problem for the LDP party, but they do not seem to affect Takaichi that much.
So how then do you think this verdict, could it affect LDP's campaign in any way ahead of the snap election?
So people say that Takaichi is trying to capitalize on her approval rates. And she announced just this week, to have a snap election coming up in early February. So one thing that I'm thinking about is that there are many more social issues that Takaichi is facing. So one of them is economy. So, there is persistent inflation and also the weak yen. And I think to what extent those economic issues play a part in the campaign will be very important when we predict the result. And I would think that, as I mentioned earlier, the corporate donation as well as the religious donation issues, they did not impact Takaichi that much on her approval rates recently. So I do not see that to be an obstacle for her approval rate in the coming months. So what we should focus on is the LDP. And I think the LDP's support rates have been low. And the economy problems right now are persistent. So we should expect that the LDP, it's a risky kind of situation for the LDP in the coming election, especially when you consider that the two opposition parties, they are forming a new alliance. So given that, I think there will be some changing games in the new coming up.
Yeah, perhaps
election.
You could elaborate a little bit more about that. Now that this case is sort of back in the headlines, so what sort of unfinished business do you think voters might focus on, and how do you think the opposition camp, how are they going to use that against the ruling party?
Thank you for your very, very interesting question. So, the Komeito broke up with the LDP, a 26-year alliance. And after that, the LDP found a new alliance partner, which is the Isinokai, the Japan Innovation Party. So when they formed the coalition, there were three very interesting political reforms that were mentioned in the coalition agreement. One of them is banning the corporate donation. One of them is to reduce the number of lawmakers. And the third one is about making Osaka the second kind of backup capital. So for the first two very important political reforms, there hasn't been going on. So there have been discussions, but there are no very tangible changes, basically, for the first two. So I would think that Takaichi, it doesn't seem that Takaichi has a strong motivation for making those political changes. Corporate donation, religious donation, or cutting the numbers of lawmakers. But instead, when I listened to the news this week about she announcing the snap election, she focused on the consumption tax, which is also another issue that the voters have been very concerned about. So basically, there has not been much changes in the consumption.
I'm afraid we have run out of time, but thanks for sharing with us some great insights. Peter Chai there, PhD researcher in political science at Waseda University. NATO chief Mark Rutte, speaking at the World Economic Forum at Davos, says that he is working to resolve the escalating row with the U.S. over Donald Trump's desire to take over Greenland.
The only way to deal with that is, in the end, thoughtful diplomacy. And when it comes to the Arctic, I think President Trump is right. Other leaders in NATO are right. We need to defend the Arctic. We know that these sea lanes are opening up. We know that China and Russia are increasingly active in the Arctic. And there's only one country bordering on the Arctic outside NATO, and that's Russia. And I would argue there is a ninth country, which is China, which is increasingly active in the Arctic region. So President Trump and other leaders are right. We have to do more there. We have to protect the Arctic against Russian and Chinese influence.
Mr. Trump is on his way to the gathering in Switzerland, his first in-person return to the event after 6 years. The American leader says it will be an interesting trip and that he has no idea about what will happen. He faces potential confrontations with European allies due to his tariff threats for not backing his Greenland plan. Well, the issue is pitting the U.S. against fellow NATO members as the autonomous island is protected through the Kingdom of Denmark.
I think that we will work something out where NATO is going to be very happy and where we're going to be very happy. But we need it for security purposes. We need it for national security and even world security. It's very important.
EU chief Ursula von der Leyen has warned against a downward spiral between allies. as she also says that Brussels prefers dialogue for solutions on the Greenland issue. The European Union chief warns that the bloc is fully prepared to act to ensure the island's autonomy.
Greenland is home to a free and sovereign people. It is a nation with its sovereignty and its right to territorial integrity, and the future of Greenland is only for the Greenlanders to decide.
Well, as the face-off over Greenland intensifies, anxiety is building among its residents, with Greenlanders telling America, hands off. Ross Cullen has more for CNA from Greenland's capital, Nuuk.
This is Greenland's snowy capital, home to just 20,000 people, a third of Greenland's population. But the town of Nuuk has been thrust into the heat of the political moment, with Washington's attempts to take control of the island.
Despite the pressure from the United States, there is a defiance here. An overwhelming majority of the population of 57,000 say they do not want to become part of the US.
The people of this remote, far northern capital are worried. They say they feel let down by the US, a country they long considered to be a friend.
I am so disappointed of Trump, and I would say he will never get our island.
We had hoped that maybe the Trump administration had forgotten us a little, but that's not. We can see that's not happening, and right now everything is really at stake.
We have never been in war with the USA before. It's only after Trump became the president we became enemy of the state, maybe.
Greenland is stunningly beautiful, and it's bigger than France, Germany and Spain combined. The US president says controlling this enormous island and preventing what he says could be a takeover by China or Russia is a matter of US national security. But there is an economic agenda as well. Beneath the vast ice sheet and snow-capped mountains lie critical rare earth deposits and untapped oil fields. But Greenlanders say only they should control the resources. Hands-off Greenland protests took place on the 17th of January here in Nuuk and in cities across Denmark, which has overall foreign policy and defence control of Greenland. The demonstrations were timed to coincide with a visit by US senators to Copenhagen to discuss the issue with Danish and Greenlandic officials. Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, later published a statement saying, "The demonstrations here at home and in Denmark have shown a strong and dignified unity. Many people have peacefully expressed love for our country and respect for our democracy. I am very grateful for that. We will not let ourselves be pressured. We stand firm on dialogue, on respect and on international law." President Trump isn't backing down.
We have to have it. They have to have this done. They can't protect it.
The US leader has threatened to impose 10% tariffs on 8 European nations if they remain opposed to US control of the territory. Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, seen here alongside her Greenlandic counterpart, said Europe won't be blackmailed. Intense diplomacy continues across Europe, both at NATO and by EU leaders.
It's clear from the consultations among EU leaders, including President von der Leyen, that the priority here is to engage, not escalate, and avoid the imposition of tariffs. Why? Because this will ultimately harm consumers and businesses on both sides of the Atlantic.
Denmark and several other European nations are expanding their military presence here in Greenland to show they are serious about the island's security, even as they pursue a diplomatic solution. For CNA, I'm Ross Cullen in Nuuk, Greenland.
Coming up next on East Asia tonight, Japan partially restarts the world's biggest nuclear plant after delays caused by a faulty alarm. Japan's biggest nuclear plant resumes operations a day later than scheduled due to an alarm malfunction. Now, it's a watershed moment marking the nation's pivot back to atomic energy. Dozens of reactors across the country were shut following the Fukushima nuclear disaster back in 2011. Well, CNA senior correspondent Micho Ishida has more.
Once the world's largest operating nuclear power plant, Kashiwazaki Kariwa in Niigata Prefecture has an output capacity of 8.21 million kilowatts. In December, the prefectural assembly, in which the ruling pro-nuclear power Liberal Democratic Party has a majority, essentially backed the governor's decision to approve a restart of the plant beginning with Unit 6. But a survey conducted by Nomura Research Institute in September last year shows 60% out of some 3,300 respondents in Niigata do not think the plant has met criteria to resume operations.
再稼働賛成の立場ではあります。地域経済とか産業に影響を与えているっていう現実的な課題に直面しているところもあって、再稼働は生活者の目線に立った分かりやすい情報提供がない。自分の生活の中に何が影響があって何が一番安全で何が脅威なのか。
The Fukushima Daiichi and Kashiwazaki Kariwa nuclear plants are run by the same operator, Tokyo Electric Power Company, which supplies energy to the capital and surrounding areas. And that is a concern for 83% of residents, according to the survey.
福島の第二を見たときに、今の我々の置かれている環境から言ったら、これアウトですよね。電源消費式がここじゃない。で、しかもここに危険負担を全部持ってくる。必要か否かって言ったら必要です。
In Japan, nuclear power was a major energy source before 2011, accounting for 25% of electricity output. But reactors were shut down after an earthquake and tsunami triggered a meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Japan's nuclear watchdog toughened rules for their restart, and gradually some reactors went back online in Kyushu and western Japan. Latest figures show nuclear energy makes up 8.5% of the mix. TEPCO is also preparing to restart another reactor at Kashiwazaki Kariwa after implementing further safety measures.
今後7号機を、再稼働するためにはこのテロ対策設備の完成をまず待たなければいけないんです。福島第一の事故で、我々にとって一番大きな教訓ですが、安全というものには絶対というものはないんだと。
TEPCO says it is looking at decommissioning some of the other 5 reactors at Kashiwazaki Kariwa. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
For more insights, let's bring in Mika Obayashi, Director at the Renewable Energy Institute. Well, thanks for joining us this evening. Firstly, help us understand what are we really seeing here? I mean, what does this really mean with the restart of this nuclear plant, and how big of a step is it for Japan?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today. It may look like a watershed moment, but I would describe it more as a policy shortcut than a strategic shift. That restart reflects short-term pressures rather than a long-term vision for Japan's energy transition. And then that we have to remind this restart mainly about improving utilities' financial conditions.
Yeah, thanks for stressing that this is sort of like a policy shortcut here. And TEPCO is also basically making a big economic case about this. I mean, it says that restarting one reactor could improve profits, to quote here, by about 100 billion yen, because Japan essentially is buying less fossil fuel. But who benefits most from those savings?
I have to say that utilities will be benefited most. And then rather than restarting the nuclear power, that reducing the energy cost is more like a very shortcut. And then if we see the long-term solutions, the renewable energies, and then more flexible grid system and investment in energy efficiency, it's a kind of a whole market reform, could be greater and a more important step for Japan.
So help us also understand this, because the plant is in Niigata. Most of the electricity actually goes to Tokyo. So is it fair that, the capital is reaping most of the rewards, whereas Niigata carries the risk? I wonder, how does that shape, public sentiment as well?
I think that I have to say that Tokyo capital people not so much concerned about that issue. And then that it is really unfair. The local resident will have the kind of a future concern of the nuclear waste and then accident, but that they will get some financial support from the government, reducing the electricity bill or something like that.
Right, and this all boils down to trust, as you've mentioned. You know, it's still fragile after what happened in Fukushima, and also there were new allegations recently of earthquake risk data being manipulated in the industry. So, what do you think TEPCO must do in the coming months, you know, to genuinely win back public trust? What sort of measurable outcomes are we looking at?
Yeah, actually, that public concern is not irrational. Nearly 70% expressing worry about the nuclear operator reflects unsolved issues of trust, governance, and accountability after Fukushima. And then actually at this time that they had some kind of a mismanagement of the spent fuel load, and then they had to postponing the restarting for several days. So the safety is not only about technology, but about institutional credibility.
And just going back to TEPCO saying that, you know, it's not symbolic, it's about avoiding a crunch during summer, and Tokyo is expected to face a power shortage this summer. What is the best way to prevent that, actually? And I mean, does restarting one nuclear reactor, how does that fit into that plan?
I have to say that, of course, that we have been experienced that the massive hot summer recent days, and then that we experienced that some electricity amount surge. But at the same time, that if I look back at several years after Fukushima accident, that there are years that we didn't have any nuclear power plant that under operation. And the nuclear power, like a 1.2 gigawatt that restart the operation, that can fit with something like a renewable energies. For example, solar PV can be integrated in the grid system 1 to 2 gigawatt every year. So I don't think that the electricity shortage is really a threat for the utility. I think that mainly that because of the financial balance sheet of the utility is required for restarting the nuclear power plant.
Yeah, sure. And just moving ahead about
the
2014 nuclear target, because Japan has this big national plan, right? It wants nuclear to provide about 20% of its electricity by 2040. I mean, is that a realistic goal? I mean, on paper it seems possible, but in practice, I mean, is it achievable?
I think that it's very difficult. That according to our calculation, that we have to reopen all the kind of available nuclear power plant by 2040. Then we could, you know, we can manage to achieve that 20% of the nuclear supply, and also that after that there will be the aged reactors that has to shut down. So the Japan's nuclear energy restarting and then the continue to operation is quite difficult.
All right, a very tough task indeed, and a hard target to reach. Really appreciate your insights, time and thoughts as well, Mika Obayashi, Director at the Renewable Energy Institute. Now, an Arctic cold front hitting East Asia is keeping large parts of the region on high alert. Across China, more than 200 major roads across a dozen provinces have been affected due to heavy snow and freezing rain. Authorities have called for countermeasures to address the extreme conditions that have also forced the closures of schools and public venues. Travel disruption in Japan along its northwestern coast, a day after the cold forced the cancellation of more than 100 flights. Severe snowfall advisories have been issued in 22 prefectures, including warnings of potential power outages and avalanches. The first peak of the cold front is forecast to hit Japan as early as tonight. Meantime, South Korean weather officials say the bitter chill is hitting the country's southwest. Nationwide forecasts for tomorrow range from 2 degrees Celsius to -19, with cold surges expected at least once every 3 days. And that rounds up Wednesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.